Around 2:30 p.m. on November 28, 2015, a man pulled into his driveway in the extremely rural city of Huron, California. He had been away overnight, and so as soon as he got out of his car, he walked right up to his porch and checked his doorknob to make sure his door was still locked. He found that it was, which was a relief. Then he unlocked it and stepped inside. However, as soon as he was inside his house, he just stopped and listened and kind of looked around. So this neighborhood that he lived in was not a safe place to live. In fact, over the past year, this guy's house had been broken into multiple times. However, he had not reported any of these break-ins to the police because he himself was wanted for felony drug possession. And so instead of getting the police involved, the man had sort of begun doing his own home security. Basically, every time he came home, he would sort of take a minute, listen, make sure nobody was in the house, and then actually sweep the house to make sure, nobody was there and that nothing had been stolen. And so as the man stood there in his doorway listening, he couldn't hear anything and nothing looked disturbed inside of his house. So he flipped on the lights, he walked into his living room and put his keys and his wallet down. And then he began doing this kind of systematic sweep through his house, checking to make sure there was nothing wrong. Checked the windows, none were broken, goes to the back door, it's still locked. He's in his kitchen, he's in, his dining room, there's nothing out of place. He did notice, however, that his mail that was sitting on one of his tables looked like maybe it had been rummaged through, but at the same time, he couldn't remember if maybe he had been kind of sloppy when he had gone over his mail before he had left the night before. So he didn't know if the mail was a sign of a break-in, but it didn't seem like it. And so after completing his sweep and feeling confident that the house was, in good order, he sat down and he relaxed. And he felt like, it had been a while since the last break-in and maybe he was being a bit too paranoid. But for now, he decided, his security protocol was good enough and he wouldn't make any changes quite yet. And he just picked up the remote, turned on the TV, and settled in for the night. However, after only a couple of minutes, the man realized his house was pretty cold and he was starting to shiver. So he stood up and he walked over and he turned on his heat. Then he sat back down on his couch. And then, about a minute later, this awful, high-pitched scream ripped through the house. It would turn out the homeowner's paranoia around break-ins was totally justified because the night before while he was gone, someone had tried to break into his home. 19-year-old Cody Caldwell had snuck onto the roof and attempted to enter this man's house through the chimney. But he got stuck about halfway down. And when the man came home and did his safety patrol and checked his house and couldn't hear or see anything, what he didn't realize was Cody was still absolutely stuck in the chimney and alive. He just wasn't making any sound. And then when the homeowner got cold and turned on the heat, what he literally did was he started an actual fire in his fireplace. And after setting this fire, Cody, who's wedged in the chimney right above this fire, began breathing in the smoke, and in his panic, he began to wiggle around and sink further and further down into this chimney, which is angled, and so he would have gotten more and more stuck until he was basically in the fire and then caught on fire. That scream was him burning alive inside of the chimney. And the man who owned the house had no idea what was going on. He just heard these screams. And then finally, when he got the fire put out and he called the police and the first responders showed up, it was already too late because Cody had died from severe burns and smoke inhalation. Of February 19th, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel in southern Mexico. It had been a long Saturday night with lots of tourists checking in and lots of confused tourists asking for directions or clarifications about things in the area. But it was finally nearing 11 p.m., which was the end of Paula's shift, and also things had calmed down near the reception desk. There wasn't much going on. And so Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone and checked it. And she saw there was a text message from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And then just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. He waved to his mom and said, hey, I parked my motorbike just down the street. Whenever you're ready, we can leave. And so Paula, she was very happy to see her son. She walked over, she gave him a kiss and a hug, and then she began gathering her things. Paula loved the fact that her son was totally comfortable driving around town with his mom on the back of his motorcycle. Other teenagers might think that was awkward, but not Miguel. But Paula knew her son absolutely loved his motorbike and basically was always looking for an excuse to ride it. And so very likely that was why he was so eager to give his mom a ride home. And so finally, after Paula had gathered up her things and said goodbye to her coworkers, She and her son walked out the front doors of the hotel, and they began walking down the road and around the corner to where Miguel always parked his bike whenever he picked his mom up from work. However, when they turned the corner and looked at the spot where Miguel said he had parked, his bike wasn't there. Now, at first, Paula asked Miguel, are you sure you parked it here? Maybe did you park it farther down the road? But Miguel said, no, this is where I always park. I definitely parked it right here. And so Miguel became convinced that someone must have stolen his bike. That was the only explanation that made sense. But Miguel still had the keys to his motorcycle, which meant whoever had stolen it had likely hotwired it. And since that takes quite a bit of time to pull off components of the bike and kind of fiddle around with the wires to make it start, Miguel was thinking that, okay, maybe they're still in the area trying to hotwire it. Let's go look for them and get the bike back. Now, the city in southern Mexico where Paula and Miguel lived was called San Cristobal de las Casas, and it was a totally beautiful place surrounded by all these hills, but it was also a very dangerous place, full of lots of street crime and violence and gangs that used the area as a hotspot for drug trafficking. And so this is not really a good place to be walking around at night, let alone trying to chase down some bike thief. But Paula and Miguel, they knew this. They lived there. They understood the risks. And Paula especially, she knew that Miguel was going to go looking for this bike because he loved that bike. And so Paula didn't hesitate and said, okay, Miguel, let's go looking. And she figured at a minimum, she could take a video or a picture of the thief if they found them with the bike, and then they could give that to police, and then maybe they could track the person down if Miguel and Paula couldn't get the bike back that night. And so Paula and Miguel began running down these side streets, looking all over the place for Miguel's bike. And you got to picture some narrow alleyways with barely any lighting. I mean, this is a sketchy area. And so they're running around, and then finally they turn a corner and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Clearly this person is pushing it away so they can hotwire it. And so Miguel and Paula begin charging down the road, and Miguel actually gets in front of this guy and stops him, and Miguel starts screaming at the guy to give him his bike back. And then Paula, she joins her son and she starts screaming at him as well and taking videos and pictures. And then as this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up behind Paula and Miguel. And as they did, Paula and Miguel heard the sound of the engine and they turned around, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a gun, aiming it at her son, Miguel, right at his chest. And so her motherly instincts kicked in and she leapt in front of her son, and then not knowing what else to do, she raised her phone and took a picture. And then seconds later, there was a loud bang, and then suddenly this guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike gave it up. He dropped the bike, he took off running down the road, and the gunman, he too turned his bike around and sped off down the road, leaving Miguel and Paula in the alleyway. Except Paula was on the ground because a second after she took that photo, the gunman had shot her in the chest. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning, orphaning Miguel and his 3 siblings. However, the photo that Paula took of her killer seconds before he killed her was such a high-quality photo showing his face that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice, and they were both arrested. Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. He arrived in country, he got a rental car, and he hired a guide to take him out to the area where he knew this cave was going to be. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook where he had taken notes the last time he was here, and he used that to find the opening to the cave. He paid the guide to stick around at the car while he went down and explored this cave. He assured him it was not going to be for a very long time. The shaft was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. The visibility inside of the shaft was limited because all you had was the light that was coming in, and because of how narrow the opening was, Jeff's body would obscure a lot of the sunlight coming in. So once Jeff got a few meters down into the tunnel, he would rely on his headlamp. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. So that's where the tunnel goes from being on an angle to being straight. And he's about to make that final descent down that final 30 meters when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. And he looks around him and he realizes from his position down on the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. As much as Jeff wanted to stop right there and go right back up to the surface, he couldn't. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear. And his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters to the bottom, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. He saw them on the rope, he's trying to brush them off. He finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up, and he begins making his way back up, and the whole time he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off to get all the spiders off of his clothing. He takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there. After he finally brushes all the spiders off, he redresses and gets in the car. And you can only imagine what the guide was thinking as he's watching this guy, this foreigner, taking his clothes off after being in this cave. But luckily, he doesn't get bit. He gets in the car with the guide and they start heading back towards the city. As they're driving, he takes his notebook out and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. He scratches that out, and on top of it, he writes, "The entrance to a young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this 4-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the 2 night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum who lived out in town and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up and he takes Karen and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway expecting to get to the end of it and look inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground. And then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was was incredibly boring. But Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera, looking down at whoever was outside at this door, and he saw there were two police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the two officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office, and there's a window into the security office, so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, "Hey, are you working alone tonight?" And Rick says, "No, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon." And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take and he goes, "Wait a minute. I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID." And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, "Why are we being arrested?" And that's when one of the officers just says, "Oh, you're not being arrested. You're being robbed." Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million. 3 p.m. on March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV upturned, partially submerged, and he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV. And so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle, when it flipped over, very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in. And so all these first responders are pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here, there's a baby in here." And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped these straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away, he figured the first responders will handle this woman and he's going to take this baby to safety because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics. And right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer Grossbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know. But we know at 10:30, she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard, and they do not have an explanation for it. Bed next to his wife, and his 10-month-old daughter was sleeping in her crib in the corner of their bedroom. And as he's laying there, he starts to hear what sounds like scuffling sounds above his ceiling. Now, above his ceiling was an attic. It was more like a crawl space because it was incredibly tight, and Jerome and his family didn't keep anything up there. They didn't spend any time up there, in fact. And so Jerome's laying here thinking, man, did an animal get up there? I mean, this is a pretty old apartment building. It's certainly possible that a squirrel or something could have crawled inside the attic, and that's what's making the sound. But eventually that night, the sound stopped and Jerome went to sleep. The next day, Jerome went up into the crawl space and there was nothing up there. But it's a pretty big space, and again, it's pretty difficult to maneuver around. So he thought, it is still possible that there could be an animal up here, but there wasn't any immediately obvious signs, and so he went back down and just hoped it would stop. A couple days go by and he hasn't heard anything in the attic, and then one night he wakes up to the sounds in the attic. And when he opens his eyes, there's a vent that sits at the top of the wall right in front of him that's actually over his daughter's crib, and he could have sworn he saw what looked like a flashlight coming from the attic. Immediately, he gets up and walks over and pulls the vent cover out, and he's looking into the attic, but it's not a good view. It's a curved vent, so at best, you're getting a little sliver of a view into the crawl space, and he didn't see any more light, and he didn't hear anything else, and so once again, he kind of chalks it up, puts the vent cover back in place, gets back in bed, and falls asleep. The next morning, he tells his wife about the light he saw in the vent, and now they had already spoken about the strange sounds coming from the attic, and she knew that perhaps there was some animal up there, but the light definitely caught her off guard. But then she remembered that next door, they were doing a whole bunch of renovations on the apartment, and perhaps the partition, there was a break in it, and they could be doing some late night work, and light could have leaked through the break in their partition wall in the attic, and maybe that was causing the flash of light. So Jerome knocks on his neighbor's door, and he says, hey, I saw a weird light in my attic, and I'm trying to see if there's a break in our partition wall that perhaps if you guys were working late last night, light could have poured through onto our side. Is that a possibility? And his neighbor said, we were not working late last night, and I've actually been up into our attic, and I've checked that partition wall because we're doing renovations, and I need to make sure this apartment is in good working order because I'm looking to sell it, and that partition wall is solid, so I don't think there's a break in it. Jerome and his wife are totally stumped, and so they decide, let's just put a security camera up in the attic and let's see what's moving around up there. Let's see what's causing the light and these sounds. So that day, Jerome goes out, he gets a little security camera, he comes home, he installs it in his attic, and then he, his wife, and his daughter go to bed. That night, Jerome doesn't wake up to any sounds in the ceiling, he doesn't see any lights, and so when he goes to check the footage the next morning, he's not expecting to see anything, but he is shocked at what he discovers. In the middle of the night, after Jerome, his wife, and his young daughter have already fallen asleep, you see on camera as the partition that separates Jerome's attic from his neighbor's attic slides open, and in crawls who else but Jerome's neighbor, Robert Havrilla, the same guy he was speaking to the day earlier about, hey, have you heard anything in the attic? Well, turned out it was his neighbor. So he comes in, he's carrying a drill and a plank of wood, and he crawls very quietly over Jerome's side of the apartment, and then he pulls aside some insulation that clearly he had already detached before because it slid out of the way very easily. He lays the plank down over some beams, and he gets himself positioned over it, and then he uses his drill to drill a hole right into Jerome's ceiling, and it would happen to be directly above his daughter's crib. He'd put the drill back, and then he'd lay there on the plank of wood and stare through the hole at Jerome's daughter for 30 minutes without flinching. After he was satisfied, he got up, pulled the plank out of the way, he slid the insulation back in place, he grabbed his grill and the plank of wood, and he crawled his way back into his side and shut the false door. Jerome calls police, who come over and they look at the footage and they immediately arrest his neighbor. But then when they go up into the attic to look for themselves, they find there's all these different drill holes that have been carefully covered over because their neighbor had been doing this for some time and had developed a sort of awful routine where he would come in and spy on the family, specifically their infant daughter. Jerome's neighbor was found guilty of criminal trespassing and was given 5 years of probation and had to pay Jerome's family $2,245. Here is the very creepy security footage of Jerome's neighbor. Stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It's this beautiful clear water spring that every summer when the weather gets really hot in Texas, people converge on Jacob's Well and enjoy swimming in the water. But it's not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It's for daredevils that strap scuba gear on and dive down through Jacob's Well through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 chambers. As you move from chamber 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces, and each of the chambers gets smaller and they get darker because you're losing sunlight, and they just become overall much more difficult to navigate the deeper you go. Imagine you put on your scuba gear and you hop into Jacob's Well and you start swimming straight down. Now there's going to be what looks like the floor of the well, and then at the center of it is a 10-foot wide shaft that goes straight down. And if you swim down through that, you're going to reach the first chamber, which sits at about 30 feet and goes all the way down to 55 feet. In that first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there's algae, there's wildlife, and it's where rookie scuba divers will spend their time in Jacob's Well. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it's more narrow than the very first one you went through. And that shaft, that tunnel, is actually what makes up the second chamber. And it brings you down all the way to 80 feet. So from 55 feet to 80 feet, you are in the second chamber, and it's basically a tube. Any diver that's going to be in Jacob's Well has to be aware when you are in the second chamber on your ascent to not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is this opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber into the first chamber, but it's not. It's a dead end that loops around before you hit a wall, and you got to go all the way back out. So hopefully you have enough air at that point. The second chamber attracts novice scuba divers and intermediate scuba divers. You still have light coming in, but it's definitely more tight, it's more claustrophobic, and because of that false chimney, it's a little bit more hazardous going into the second chamber. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, which is the bottom of the second chamber, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your tanks on that will bring you into a very small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there's all the silt and loose gravel inside of the third chamber that if your fin so much as knocks it, it will float into the water and then it will blind you. The third chamber is only from 80 feet to 90 feet, so it's only 10 feet of water. Generally speaking, you only see expert divers going into the third chamber. At the bottom of the third chamber is this heavy metal grate that sits over this tiny little opening, and that is the opening to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it looks like inside of the fourth chamber because, one, as soon as you go in there, it's impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, so you're going in blind. But two, anyone that has attempted to go into the fourth chamber and maybe has been successful has died. There are literally divers that are deceased inside of the fourth chamber. And after about a dozen people died trying to get into that fourth chamber, they finally just sealed it up. But if you were to pry open that gate and go into the fourth chamber, you would have to remove your air tanks, push them into the fourth chamber, and then you'd have to wriggle your way through while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth into the fourth chamber that, again, we don't even know what's in there. In 1983, 24-year-old college students Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 p.m. They were both experienced scuba divers. They were in an advanced scuba diver class with all the certifications for that. They had dove Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water. They went through that initial shaft into the first chamber. They continued into the tunnel that was the second chamber. They wriggled their way into the third chamber, and they reached the gate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open this gate, and Richard Patton was the first one to go into the fourth chamber. He removed his tanks and pushed them inside of this opening, and then he began headfirst to slither inside of this fourth chamber opening while Clark waited. And Clark would later say that as soon as Richard had pushed his way and had actually made it into the fourth chamber, Richard comes screaming up back out of the fourth chamber. And Clark realizes that he doesn't have a mouthpiece in. He doesn't have scuba tanks on. Richard is desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold because he's dropped his tanks, and he's reaching for Clark to help him get pulled through this hole, and he can barely get out of this hole. And as soon as he gets free, Clark takes his mouthpiece off and he jams it into Richard's mouth. And so they begin buddy breathing. One guy breathes while the other guy holds his breath, and then they reverse that back and forth, back and forth. That's not something you would do on a dive for a long period of time. It's an emergency procedure, and you need to get to the surface as soon as you can. So the pair calms down, they're buddy breathing, and they're making their way back up. They're leaving the equipment that they lost in the fourth chamber, and they're kicking their way up, and they get back into the third chamber. They make their way up into the second chamber. They're kicking it out, and then their heads hit the wall. and they realize they've gone down the false chimney, and what's even worse is they hear that awful ka-thunk, which means you have no air in your tanks. Clark, who had taken a full breath before this had happened, he immediately turns and starts swimming and manages to get out of the false chimney and makes it to the surface before he drowns. But Richard wasn't as lucky. His final few moments were spent in total darkness with silt kicked up all around him. He's got no air, he's got no idea where to go, and he's desperately trying to swim up, but he keeps hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. 2 p.m. on September 24th, 2017, a 17-year-old college student named Sanjay climbed up onto this boulder that was right off to the side of this hiking trail that he was on. Sanjay was on a day trip with about 20 of his friends from college, and they were in this part of southern India that was really famous for its long, winding trails and all these boulders that kind of sat off to the side of the trails. And then at the end of these trails that are in this part of India is this beautiful ancient Hindu temple that a lot of people will go and take pictures in front of and go inside of. And so that was where Sanjay and his friends were ultimately headed, was this temple. And from the boulder that Sanjay had just climbed up on, he looked up the trail, and from his view now, which was now slightly higher, he could actually see just barely the top of this temple. And so he was really excited about going to see it, and he couldn't believe how close they were. But as he was standing on this boulder, staring at the top of the temple, he also realized that kind of off to the side of the temple, basically right next to it, was this beautiful pool of water with a big wall around it and cement steps leading into it. I mean, it kind of looked like a swimming pool. And so because Sanjay and his friends had been hiking all day to this point, and it was really hot out, Sanjay really liked the idea of going swimming. And so he actually jumped off the boulder and just started running towards the temple and this pool. And he was yelling to his friends as he did, like, hey, I'm gonna go swimming. And so he ran, not to the temple, but to this random pool of water that was next to it. And he got to the steps and he immediately took off his shirt and he pulled his phone out of his pocket and he put it on the steps. And then he walked his way into the water and turned around, hoping to see his friends coming after him. And sure enough, all of his friends were smiling and laughing and running after him, ripping their shirts off, putting their phones down and jumping in too. And so pretty soon, this very quiet, peaceful pool next to this temple was packed full of very rowdy and crazy college kids. Now, to be clear, this pool of water was not intended to be a swimming area. It was dug about 300 years earlier for this temple, and many people began to view this pool of water as sacred because they believed it could cure diseases. And so what Sanjay and his friends were doing was totally taboo and not allowed. But I can promise you, Sanjay and his friends did not care. They were having a great time. And in fact, Sanjay was having such a great time that when he turned around and looked back up the steps they'd all charged in on, he saw one of his friends, whose name was Vishwas, was standing up out of the water reading what looked like a plaque about this pool of water. And Sanjay hated the idea of one of their buddies not getting to experience this fun. And so Sanjay, a little out of pocket, yelled out to Vishwas like, hey, stop reading that and get in the water. Let's go. What are you doing? And Vishwas was obviously kind of embarrassed to be called out so publicly in front of the, 19 other kids that were there. They're all looking up at him expectantly now, like, yeah, get in here, man. And Vishwas, he's like, okay, fine. And so he took off his shirt, put his phone down as well, and he got in the water with all of them. And very shortly after he did that, Sanjay kind of forgot about him and decided, hey, this would be a great time to take a photo of everybody here, memorialize this amazing trip. And so Sanjay, he waded over to the steps, he grabbed his phone, he came back towards the group, and he's looking at this big rowdy crowd of his friends who are totally not paying attention to him. And he's saying, hey guys, come over here. I want to take your photo, gather up, I'll take a photo of all of us. And so it took a couple of minutes, but eventually, all these kids got in frame, and Sanjay, he held the phone out, made sure everybody was there, and they all smiled, and he took a picture. And then after he took the picture, Sanjay put his phone back on the steps and returned to just splashing and goofing around with his friends. About an hour later, Sanjay and his friends had left the pool and were now in the temple and were just walking around exploring. But eventually, Sanjay just got tired of looking inside the temple. It was not very interesting to him. And so he eventually just went outside again and sat down on this low wall that was right outside the temple. And because he knew his friends would not be done for at least, 15 or 20 minutes or so, he just pulled out his phone and began kind of scrolling through social media and, doing what we all do on our phones. But eventually, Sanjay opened up his photo album to look at all the photos he had taken during the hike in, and then also that picture in the pool, and then also some pictures he took inside of the temple. And so he pulls up his pictures and just kind of starts scrolling through them, and he eventually reaches the photo that he took, selfie style, in the pool with all of his friends together. And so he opens that picture up and he looks at it and he smiles because it definitely was the best picture he took. He got all his buddies in frame. Everybody seemed so happy. But as Sanjay was looking at this photo, he realized there was something odd about it. There was just something in this photo that just seemed like it shouldn't be. And as he looked more closely at it, the smile on his face faded and he began to panic just a little bit. He didn't know if what he was looking at was real or not, but he knew he had to go find out. And so Sanjay put his phone away and he looked up and began looking around outside the temple at all the other people who had left, and many of them included his friends. And they were walking around, talking in groups or whatever. And Sanjay, he began looking at all of his friends and he would stare at their faces. He was looking for something, but he didn't see what he was looking for. And so after scanning the entire outside and not feeling satisfied, Sanjay got up and speed walked back into the temple and began going into each and every room, looking at every single person he encountered. And when he would find one of his friends, he would stare at their face. And when he didn't find what he was looking for, he just kept on going to every single room until finally he reached the last room of the temple and he found the last of his friends and he looked at their faces and still he did not see what he was looking for. And so now Sanjay is truly panicked. He's actually horrified at this point. He runs back outside and he finds their college professor who had come along to sort of chaperone the trip. And he ran up to this professor and he pulled out his phone. He opened up that photo of them in the pool and he showed the professor what he had found. And Sanjay pointed out the strange thing about this photo. And so the professor, he began looking at the photo too. And right away, he also could see this very strange thing that seemed very out of place. And so the professor asked Sanjay a few follow-up questions, about like what Sanjay had done since discovering this. And after Sanjay said, I've been all over the temple, I still can't figure it out. And so the professor knew the police would have to get involved. And so the professor got in touch with police. And so the police came out to the temple not long after that. And the students, so Sanjay and all of his friends, had been instructed to stay right by the temple. Do not go down to the pool, stay up here, let the police handle it. And so when the police came in, they came running by the group, and Sanjay and his friends were just kind of watching anxiously, waiting to see what happens. And then as the officers went down to the pool, from where Sanjay and his friends were standing, they actually did not have a clear view. The temple itself blocked their view, so they could not see the pool, but they could hear what the officers were doing. And at first, as Sanjay and his friends are standing there really nervously, they don't hear anything down at the pool. But then they hear one of the officers shout something out, like he's found something. And then Sanjay and his friends heard all this splashing as clearly officers were jumping into the pool. And it was at this moment when Sanjay heard that splashing that he knew the thing he saw in this photo, it had to be real. As horrible as that was, it had to be real. The reason why Sanjay's friend Vishwas was not in the water with everybody else, why he was up reading that plaque about the history of this pool, was because Vishwas did not know how to swim, but he didn't tell anyone. Nobody knew this. And so he was probably kind of embarrassed about it. And so maybe he was reading this plaque as sort of a way to, act distracted, like the plaque is the reason he's not swimming. But then when Sanjay, who meant no harm by this, but he yelled out to Vishwas, "Hey, come on, dude, get in here. Come swimming with us." Because he did it so publicly in front of all the other friends, it seems like Vishwas felt very pressured into getting into the water. And that's what he did. Instead of telling anybody that he could not swim, he just kind of shrugged, took off his shirt, pulled his phone out of his pocket, put it on the ground, and waded into the water. And as soon as he did, the entire group just kind of went back to goofing around and splashing and being totally chaotic. And then when Sanjay was like, "Hey, let's take that photo," he really did manage to get all of his friends in frame somehow, except one of them was Vishwas, and you can only see the top of his head. It's because he was drowning in the background of that photo, just nobody knew it. And so obviously an hour later, when Sanjay's looking at this photo, he sees the top of Vishwas's head and he's like, wait a minute, is he goofing around or is he drowning? And then he ran all around the temple looking for Vishwas. He wanted to prove that he was not in the pool still, that he was up here. But then after searching the entire area and not finding Vishwas, he went to his professor, they called the police, and the discovery was made. And unfortunately, by the time police pulled Vishwas out of the water, he was already deceased. 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do. So he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide and he stands up, turns around and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire. There's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside. And after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, you know, stranger things have happened. So that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off. Clearly, there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, you know, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away. And so Matt just goes back to his campsite and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. And when the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd pick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods.
Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?